c'est eux qui me donnent le micro? C'est eux qui me donnent le micro? Allô? Ouais, ok. Good evening. On entend? Ouais. Good evening and welcome to this event. My name is Thomas Heimgartner. I'm the focal point at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation for the CFS, for the Committee on World Food Security. First of all, let me thank Christophe Collet for organizing this event and the Geneva Academy, all to our panelists in advance for, I'm sure, very interesting contributions and a very interesting discussion, and all of you for coming. It's a rather intimate setting, but let's make it an even more lively discussion. I would just like to introduce by pointing out 3 reasons why Switzerland welcomes and supports this event. 2 of them are rather obvious. The first one, it gives us a space to reflect and draw conclusions on the advancement of one very essential human right, the right to food. Second, it gives us the space to interact between different stakeholders that make the richness and diversity of international Geneva. And I'm very happy that on the panel we have persons who represent institutions which you would not necessarily put into the human rights box of Geneva. So we're very happy that this evening allows us to think outside of the box. The third reason is the wider context of this event as a contribution to the monitoring mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security, the CFS. And that is, in terms of providing accountability for an international instrument, a point that is very dear to Switzerland. To give briefly some context on this point, since the adoption of the Voluntary Guidelines, Christophe, you allow that I hold this up, of the Voluntary Guidelines, which we are talking about today in 2004, the committee has developed and adopted other sets of guidelines. The most famous ones are maybe the ones on the governance of land tenure and the ones on responsible agricultural investments. But there is another whole family of other recommendations and guidelines next to these major products. And since 2016, and that is a recent development, and that brings us here today basically, the committee has also started to monitor, not only discuss and agree on the guidelines through a multi-stakeholder process, but really also adopting a monitoring mechanism and look at the use and application of the guidelines it adopts in regular intervals. And this coming October, the plenary of the CFS will look at the voluntary guidelines of the right to food. And in these first months of the year in different countries, partly also facilitated by FIAN, in different countries there are national events on how these guidelines have been used and applied at the national level. And here we are in the very particular country of international Geneva. And so this discussion today is a contribution to that discussion in October. It is also, of course, has its value as a standalone event, but for us it's also important to put it in this context of a contribution to a monitoring mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security. So with this, I would again like to thank everybody for coming, and I'll pass the mic to Christophe, who will introduce panelists and the format of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a great pleasure for the Geneva Academy to be associated with this event. We have discussed that in the last few months, and as I've worked on the right to food since 15 or a bit more years, it was really a pleasure to organize that and to have the opportunity to bring to what is happening in Rome at the Committee on World Food Security a bit also what is happening in Geneva. And so that the idea of this event, as you understood, is to make links between Geneva and Rome. And I remember because I was working with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Jean Ziegler, when the guidelines were negotiated from 2002 to 2004. And it came, these guidelines, the decision to negotiate these guidelines was because of FAO report on the fact that despite commitments to reduce hunger in 1996, nothing was done from 1996 to 2002. And the main conclusion was that it was because of a lack of accountability of states. And so the rights-based approach to the fight against hunger was pushed by some states, and all states agreed to elaborate guidelines to guide states to fight hunger with a rights-based approach. And so we have these 19 guidelines adopted in 2004. And I do remember that when we did few country missions with Ziegler, after that, some states were using the guidelines, and we were using the guidelines to make them accountable. I remember once in Guatemala receiving a report of 50 pages of the government of Guatemala on how they have implemented the guidelines, each of them. And I also remember what was happening in Brazil just after the adoption of the guidelines with Lula in 16th of October 2005, World Food Day, who did a speech in which he said he will implement the guidelines in Brazil. And then his statement was signed by 200 public institutions in Brazil, and the guidelines were translated in Portuguese and distributed to 5,000 municipalities so that municipalities in Brazil can also implement the guidelines. And that was the very beginning of a process in Latin America in which lots of states decided to adopt national laws on the right to food or to create a national council on food security and nutrition, including the right to food in their work and fighting hunger with a rights-based approach. Some have been very successful, like Brazil, and maybe others have been less successful. So I hope that tonight we will discuss the lessons learned from this implementation of the guidelines in the last 14 years, what has worked, what has not worked. And so for that, we have a great panel today. Professor Olivier de Scoeter will speak first. He's a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food from 2008 to 2014. Kaya Engelsveen from the Department of Nutrition and Health for Health and Development at WHO is a specialist on national policies on nutrition, and she will talk about the work of WHO on nutrition, and it's linked to guidelines, voluntary guidelines number 10, which is all about the promotion of nutrition to fight hunger and malnutrition. Then we'll have Dr. Ana Maria Suarez Franco, who is the Geneva representative of FIAN International, and FIAN International has done lots of work in the last 14 years to promote the guidelines in various settings, so she will explain what they have done. Then I propose we will have Dr. Elvis Betulayev from ILO, International Labour Organization, a rural economy specialist, who will tell us what ILO is doing, for example, to protect a decent wage so that people have access to food. And then we will have Su Long Li, who is the Secretary General of IUF, which is a workers' union organization which has more than 400 affiliates. And she will say what her organization, but also if she wants to also say what ILO has done from her perspective to protect the right to food of agricultural workers. So it will give us really lots of information about what Geneva-based international institutions have done in the last 14 years to implement the guidelines. Maybe it's also to implement the right food or food security. Maybe they didn't explicitly use the guidelines. They might explain that. But it's, we are all here tonight to look at what has worked and not worked in the fight against hunger in the last 14 years. So with that, I leave the floor to Olivier de Scoeter for the first presentation.
Okay, well, many thanks to Christophe and Thomas Heimgartner, for these introductions. And it's a great pleasure, colleagues, to share this event with you. Let me start by recalling why the voluntary guidelines in support of the progressive realization of the right to adequate food were so important when they were adopted in 2004. First of all, as Christophe sort of alluded to, they were the result of a process through which the international community realized that to combat hunger and malnutrition, it was not enough to rely on increased production, on the solutions of engineers and agronomists, or even on the prescriptions of economists. To me, the starting point of that realization that accountability matters was the book published in 1981 by Amartya Sen on famines in the 20th century, Poverty and Famines, subtitled An Essay on Entitlement and Deprivation, in which Amartya Sen examined 4 major famine episodes of the 20th century and concluded that these famines actually occurred even in times of plenty. And what Amartya Sen basically asked us was to change our lenses and to look at hunger as a result of a failure for governments to provide social justice, a failure to respond in time to the needs of the population, a failure to take into account that certain groups of the population had their incomes suddenly decline without benefiting any form of social protection. In other terms, it was a question of accountability, of democracy, rather than just a question of production. And it is against that background that indeed in 1996, the World Food Summit requested that the right to food be clarified in its normative content, which led the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to adopt a general comment on the right to food in 1999, that's general comment number 12. And 5 years later, actually 6 years later, the World Food Summit 2002 launched the negotiation on what were to become the voluntary guidelines in support of the progressive realization of the right to food, the right to food guidelines. The result of an intergovernmental negotiation process. And the reason why they were so important, these guidelines, is not simply because of this expression of this new faith in accountability to reduce hunger and malnutrition. It was also because this was an intergovernmental process in which states negotiated line by line a very thick, long document that usually would be produced by experts working within some office or some room in the UN system without states actually being able to achieve agreements. This is a very detailed and operational text, yet it is the result of an intergovernmental negotiation. And Christophe Gollet is actually a bit too modest because he played a very central role in that negotiation in the years 2002-2004. What is, of course, also very striking in these guidelines is that they are developed outside the human rights system in a committee of the FAO, the Committee on World Food Security, and then adopted by the FAO Council in November 2004. Yet it is, of course, a document that is highly relevant to the right to food. And it's paradoxical that one of the challenges that we face today is how to ensure that that document, those guidelines, are imported back into Geneva when it was developed in Rome. And the same can be said to a large extent for the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries and forests, or indeed the voluntary guidelines on sustainable small-scale fisheries that were adopted in 2014, and some other similar documents that are highly relevant to human rights work, but have developed outside the human rights system and that therefore are treated as almost suspect or at least alien to the human rights bodies that sit in Geneva. Let me say a few words about the impacts of the guidelines adopted in 2004. Christophe Gollet has already mentioned that in some world regions, they had a major impact in reshaping domestic, legal, institutional, and policy frameworks. And that was particularly the case, he mentioned, rightly, in Latin America. It started with Argentina in 2003, and then it continued with Guatemala in 2005, not least thanks to Jean Ziegler. It continued with Ecuador in 2006, Brazil in 2006, Venezuela in 2008, Nicaragua in 2009. All these states adopted, in this very short time span of just 6 or 7 years, framework laws on the right to food, establishing usually consultative bodies, national food security and nutrition councils, in which civil society was represented. And that was made possible thanks to two levers that allowed for such a development to take place. First of all, the regional office of the FAO in Santiago de Chile was very active on this issue, headed at the time by José Graziano da Silva, who was very closely involved in those years also in the setting up of the 4Me0 strategy of the Lula government. And secondly, parliamentarians in Latin America joined their efforts, forming a parliamentary front against hunger, Frente Parlamentario contra el Hambre, that sought to disseminate these good practices in that region. Of course, the fact that these countries have Spanish in common facilitates this sharing of good practices. We haven't quite seen the same level of commitment in other world regions, although we do have some interesting examples in Africa, very few though in other regions of the world, that literally try to implement these guidelines, particularly by establishing such a framework for the development of national strategies for the implementation of the right to food. Now, clearly, this is something the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, or the Special Rapporteurs on the right to food in their respective mandates have been trying to promote. And it is, of course, a unique tool as Special Rapporteur to be able to travel to countries and speak to governments and the local administrations about the importance of these guidelines, something that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights cannot do, as it sits in Geneva and does not travel. However, I should perhaps note that within the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, we are trying to develop the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, taking into account a series of documents or instruments that have been developed outside the human rights world strictly defined. And the Right to Food Guidelines of 2004 are one example, but we also refer regularly to the Sustainable Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, to the Guidelines on the Responsible Governance of Tenure of Land, Fisheries and Forests, all three negotiated within the FAO. We also refer, for example, to the Recommendation 202 of the International Labour Conference on Social Protection Floors, and we adopted a statement to that effect in 2015, and we refer increasingly to Recommendation 204 adopted by the International Labour Conference in 2005 concerning the transition from the informal to the formal economy. And finally, because the World Health Organization is represented, we refer quite systematically to the International Code on the marketing of breast milk substitutes and subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions. All this is to say that we as a committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, are quite open to reading the requirements of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, taking into account those important statements that show a consensus on how to address certain issues in other fora. And the 2004 guidelines on the right to food are just one example. I believe that, however interesting it is to look at how the guidelines have been implemented at domestic level, and as I said, the special rapporteurs, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights are trying to do their part, I think one area in which really much more should be done concerns the impacts of these guidelines at international level in the work of different UN agencies and in different international fora. There is a professed commitment to implement the Right to Food guidelines, for example, expressed in the Rome Declaration adopted at the World Summit on Food Security of November 2009. Principle number 3 of the 5 Rome Principles refers to the Right to Food guidelines. That's fine and welcome, but in reality, many parts of the guidelines, in order to be implemented well, would need much more support from some international agencies that do not really take those guidelines as a reference point and indeed seem to be ignoring these guidelines pretty much entirely. This is naturally not the case for the ILO, it's not the case for the World Health Organization. It is, these are two organizations that are very active in implementing the commitments made in these guidelines, but many guidelines are ignored because they actually depend for the implementation on agencies who do not have this same concern. Let me take, for example, Guideline 8B on land, that refers to security of land tenure, but also to access to land for women and the poor. That's, in my view, a quite important guideline, but in fact, most recommendations that states receive on how to manage tenure rights encourage them to develop titling schemes that commodify land and that are not redistributive in nature, instead can encourage further speculation on land and increase inequalities in rural areas and agrarian concentration. And unfortunately, the agencies that could send a different message are ignoring the Right to Food guidelines. Similarly, Guideline 8D on genetic resources for food and agriculture is entirely ignored by the Secretariat of the UPOV Convention, Union pour la protection des obtentions végétales, which is linked to WIPO and which promotes the UPOV Convention that actually protects plant breeders' rights and I believe is not sufficiently attentive to protecting the rights of farmers. Despite Guideline 8D of the Guidelines on the Right to Food that tries to insist on a balance between the rights of the ones and the rights of the others. This is in part compensated by the work of the Secretary of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture of 2001, but the tension is real between the UPOV Convention and the international treaty I've mentioned. To take yet another example, we have Guideline 8E on sustainability that insists on the need to respect the limited carrying capacity of ecosystems in how we shape agricultural development. Well, however important that is, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, does not refer to that guideline in its work, although it does a lot, sending a similar message. Similarly, the UN Convention on, to combat desertification could use this guideline much more, linking its work to the right to food, but it is not using this lens. And I could continue these examples. The most striking to me has to do with trade and with macroeconomic policies. We have a guideline number 12 in the guidelines on the right to food, titled National Financial Resources, that relates to financing food policies, that recommends to avoid cuts in social expenditures, that recommends transparency in the use of resources. But actually, the messages sent by the International Monetary Fund, or in some cases by the World Bank, depending on which documents you read from the World Bank, point to the exact opposite set of recommendations. And on trade, finally, we have part 3 of the guidelines on the right to food that relate to the more international dimensions of the right to food. There's a reference to international trade, but neither the World Trade Organization nor the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development use the right to food guidelines in their recommendations as to how trade could be shaped for development and for combating hunger and malnutrition. There are many other examples, but we don't have time to go through them. My point is that for these international dimensions of the right to food to be truly realized, we would need a much more cross-agency commitment to implementing the right to food guidelines. But this we do not have. We actually meet regime resistance that is sometimes deliberate, mostly is unconscious. Each of these agencies, each of these regimes have their own sacred cows, their own taboos, their own path dependencies, and their own, set of political games. And it makes it very difficult for them to look into a document elaborated within the FAO and consider that they have a role in supporting the implementation of that document. In addition, within the FAO itself, the Right to Food unit, as it was called at some point in time, has been degraded to the status of the Right to Food team. It had at some point in time 24 people in headquarters in Rome and 16 people in the regional offices of the FAO, a very strong unit in the years 2006, 2010. And now it has, I believe, about 4 people, including 2 interns on short-term contracts, interns or short-term consultants, working to promote the Right to Food guidelines. There has not been in recent years sufficient support within the FAO itself for the advocacy and promotional work around the Right to Food guidelines, and that is a second problem. The third problem that is an obstacle to these Right to Food guidelines being actually taken seriously in many fora and agencies where they could matter is that the ideological discussion between, on the one hand, food security advocates who see trade, economic growth, green revolution-like solutions as key to achieving the eradication of hunger and malnutrition, on the one hand, and the food sovereignty advocates, on the other hand, that have been increasingly influential and audible in public debates since the last 20 years, that debate is one in which the right to food has been, justifiably so, seen as not neutral. And the right to food advocates, given that they recommend the democratization of food policy making, given that they try to promote a stronger role for civil society in designing these policies and monitoring their implementation, they have been siding with food sovereignty advocates. And as a result, the right to food was seen as suspicious, as subversive, as dangerous, and unfortunately, the right to food has not been capable of expanding its audience in recent years, in part as a result of this deep ideological debate within that global discussion. So these are some introductory remarks I wanted to make, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
I don't know if they will come.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's all black.
Yeah.
I was thinking a series of presenters without any visual break for the eye. There it comes. Great. Perfect. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting WHO to this panel tonight. I was asked to talk about the progress made in the promotion of nutrition through the work of WHO in the context of Guideline 10 on nutrition on the right to food. And I was thinking, gosh, what are we not doing? Because if we look at the key concepts, which are in the Guideline 10, which is the operationalization of the right to food, those are the core mandate of what we work in WHO. And our role is to further operationalize each of these key concepts. And I could probably go on for hours about any of these, but in 10 minutes scope, we won't do that. But generally, the work that we do, can be divided into 3 categories. So we support policy development and implementation at national level and global level. We drive the policy agenda. We develop evidence-informed guidance and implementation tools for countries to take this forward. And we support monitoring and target setting. At global level, we have the global nutrition targets. We define indicators, we define cutoffs, and we also support monitoring systems in countries, which are important and as a first step of accountability. So through this work, WHO supports countries to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to adequate food. I will have a look at a couple of examples from this, just to show you a little bit about the breadth of the work that WHO is doing. So the first I wanted to look into was the counteracting of misinformation. And Oliver de Schutter kindly mentioned the International Code on Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. But since 2016, we actually had also guidance on all age groups of children to counteract marketing of unhealthy or unnecessary foods and beverages to children that are marketed often also inappropriately. So having a regulation is obviously not enough. It also needs to be monitored and enforced at the country level. So in this regard, WHO, in collaboration with UNICEF, we have established a global network, which is called the Netcode, that support countries in setting up robust ongoing systems to monitor and enforce legal measures aimed at reducing the inappropriate marketing of infant foods. So Netcode has developed protocols for this purpose, which promotes a multi-sectoral approach, including also to engage national human rights institutions in countries, which may then use their mandates to monitor the violations of national code legislation in the context of the right to health, the right to food, and to appropriate information and protection from inappropriate information. Another key area that we work on, which is much related to the right to adequate food, is the protection and promotion of healthy diets. So in our work, we are defining what constitute healthy diets in terms of what are the nutrients that is considered healthy, the level of fats, sugars, salt, and so on. You have probably all heard it. And this is based on dietary guidelines and evidence-informed guidelines on dietary goals. In addition, we are also monitoring the situation in countries, and you see the graph here. It shows the percentage of countries that are implementing actions to promote and protect healthy diets. So while we have seen through our monitoring that there has been an increase in countries in introducing regulations to protect healthy diet, especially for nutrition labeling, there is still a high focus on information approaches to inform the consumers, to let them have the responsibility to make the decision, whereas those approaches that change the food environment through reformulation of foods or banning vending machines or regulating marketing, they are less common. Another powerful tool, which I wanted to talk about here tonight, which is very much conducive with promoting human rights, are the WHO Child Growth Standards of 2006. These standards, they were developed based on a multi-country study which showed that infants and children from very different regions of the world, they actually have the same similar growth patterns if they are given the right conditions, meaning that they have good hygiene, their mothers are given the right counseling, then they grow equally. And this is actually giving the scientific evidence that children have the same potential and right to grow and develop. So malnutrition, it reflects the violation of rights at multiple levels. Currently, today in the world, we have 155 million children that are stunted, meaning they're too short for their age. 52 million are wasted, they are too thin for their weight. And in addition, 41 million are overweight, and these often coexist in the same countries, in the same communities, and even in the same families, this double burden of malnutrition. So from expanding what is in the voluntary guideline, it says needs of different target groups across the life cycle. We need to also consider the needs and the rights to evidence-informed interventions, because evidence-informed interventions exist, and they can be used to address this situation. So looking forward, WHO has recently developed a 10-year nutrition strategy which covers all countries, all forms of malnutrition, and health and well-being in the broader sense. And this strategy, it states that nutrition needs to be addressed at every stage of life, and access to a healthy diet is a human right. It also outlines collaboration with the Human Rights Council and the special rapporteurs on the right to food and the right to health. And beyond this nutrition plan, you may also know that WHO, organization-wide, we are developing our next general program of work, which will span from 2019 to 23. And this draft document, which will be discussed at the World Health Assembly in May, it also has a lot of reference to the human rights system. Even with a quote from our new Director General, Dr. Tedros, on the cover page saying, health is a human right. The nutrition strategy, it has the same time frame as the United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition. I hope you have all heard about that. The Nutrition Decade, the General Work Program, it builds on the International Conference on Nutrition, the second International Conference on Nutrition, which was held in 2014 in Rome. And it was called for there. It was adopted, was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in 2016. And his work that WHO is leading jointly with FAO. So the work program, I won't read the quote, but definitely it's building on human rights again. The Nutrition Decade, it serves as an umbrella to accelerate the implementation of the recommendations and commitments coming out of the second International Conference on Nutrition. In order to achieve the global nutrition targets, the global diet-related NCD targets, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So how will we do it? Well, specifically, countries are making smart commitments to accelerate national action. And the first country to do that was Brazil, which, as you know, since 2010 also have integrated the right to food into their constitution. And in their commitment, so their smart commitment on Nutrition Decade, they also have a commitment on the right to food specifically. Another means of implementation are the action networks that we are encouraging member states to lead. They are informal country networks. They take forward specific actions such as salt reduction, nutrition labeling, sustainable fisheries, etc. There is not yet any network which are looking at how to integrate specifically the right to food into national policies, but that's something we are encouraging different collaborators to do, and we are working, for example, with the Oslo-based Fork group and are encouraging them to maybe start an expert network that could help countries and support countries to do that. So thank you again for inviting me here.
Thank you very much. Now, after two presentations by UN bodies or human rights bodies and WHO, now we have the pleasure to have Ana Maria Suarez Franco to speak about the role of the civil society, and in particular FIAN International, who is the main organization in the world working on the right to food. Thank you.
Is that working? So thank you very much to the Geneva Academy for Human Rights and all the organizers. FIAN has been working on the right to food since 1986 and has been very active in the process of development and adoption of the voluntary guidelines on the right to food. So to tell all what we have been doing in 10 minutes, it's a bit a challenge, but I will highlight some issues. And maybe I would like to remember that one of the main achievements that we have in this process is the fact that those affected by hunger and malnutrition have been included in the whole process, especially taking into account that the guidelines were a bit a way to revive the Committee on Food Security, and that this committee has a civil society mechanism which articulates social movements, and Sue can say more about that. This has been a big example also for what we are doing here in Geneva, and to ensure that those who are producing the food but also suffering the main problems from hunger and malnutrition are part of the political debate. Beginning with the achievements, I would say one of the problems that we had in the past when we talked to governments on the right to food, as it is in the covenant or in the general comment, is that that was still very general for application in the administrative law, for application in the judicial level, etc. And the guidelines bringing the whole approach of the right to food with all its components has been very helpful to impulse processes towards the realization of the right to food. And this has been reflected in the laws that have been mentioned from Olivier. The laws are not just referring to one of the components in many of the countries, but really go from the production and the access to natural resources till the nutrition, covering, of course, what is different in the right to food and is the element of accountability, and changing the logic to put the person as a beneficiary of a policy to a rights holder who can claim. This, of course, brought also to decisions by different tribunals in the world. FIAN has been supporting cases brought to court in Guatemala, in Colombia, in Nepal, in India, and for judges, the voluntary guidelines have been of help in understanding the whole nature of this right. And of course, for us, the fact that many communities also have incorporated the use of these guidelines, but also of the tenure guidelines that were prepared as a next step in the development of better understanding how to implement the right to food, has been very useful. Also at the regional level, we have observed some developments. It's quite new, but we were working already since 2010 for a monitoring process by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. Now the Organization of American States has a process which, in the frame of the San Salvador Protocol, establishes a mechanism to monitor how states in the region are implementing the right to food, and all the indicators developed in this for the right to food, they are also monitoring other rights, were very inspired by the work that we were doing when we worked on the implementation of the voluntary guidelines. Also, the African system comes with some developments a bit later. All that is a process. And now there is a reflection for the adoption of regional guidelines on the right to food. FIAN is working together with the Commission to ensure the needed coherence, which is also a quite new development. At the international level, of course, we have been very involved in supporting the work of the Committee on Food Security. We think that the guidelines were a way to revive the work of this committee, which in fact makes more precise how to comply with the international obligations under the right to food that is in the covenant, but which can also be used by other members of the UN that have not ratified the covenant but are under the declaration. And of course, very important for us has been the work with the treaty bodies. Olivier was explaining more the outcome. We were working with the Committee on with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from the beginning on to ensure that then when civil society presents the parallel reports to the committee, they could use the existing elements of the guidelines. And I will come back to that later, but methodologies have been developed to ensure that according to the different national context, the organizations developing this information for the committees could use the guidelines. as outcome of it, we have all the recommendations. Olivier has been talking about the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but also since 2011, we had the first recognition of the right to food by CEDAW, even if the right to food is not recognized as such in the convention, but connected to other articles of the convention, like on rural women and nutrition. And the more challenging for us has been the work with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, where still the vision is very medicalized and very disconnected from access to resources and all the social determinants of undernutrition. So we continue working on it, but we see that the guidelines have been of big help in coming to the more specific application of the right. Maybe coming to the challenges, one of the challenges has been mentioned by Olivier, and that's the fragmentation in the application. We have seen, of course, that even if we are all the time trying to connect the different steps of the food chain and how the food systems work, still many international agencies just focus in their specific part. And this brings to some gaps in the realization that we are still working to try to connect. Other of the gaps, of the problems that I have noted, but you already mentioned, Olivier, is the weakened situation of the Right to Food unit. We have to say that on the beginning of the work, the Right to Food unit has been key in developing methodologies and tools that are very helpful for the government, but of course, just having a book on a topic, you don't have a process in the administrative function of a state. And the FAO is the organization that could help the states in developing these processes in the reality and monitoring its implementation. And now the fact that the unit is very weak makes our work as civil society more difficult. We can, in some cases, support the states, but this is not our work, and therefore we really feel the gap. And maybe other of the challenges that I could point out is that even if we have all these recommendations of the different bodies here in Geneva, implementation is not always very easy. We would need more support by all the agencies that have been mentioned in order to get this implementation. And one fora that has been quite difficult to progress with the right to food has been the UPR, in the frame of the Human Rights Council, where still the recommendations on the right to food are quite weak, even if we bring the demands of the communities and of the social movements. Very quickly, FIAN has been working on methodologies, of course not alone, but these have been methodologies prepared together with the FAO, with the social movement, with academics. And one of the first that we did was this screen state action against hunger. And this was the effort to take every one of the guidelines and to develop questions on structures, process, and outcomes that could serve the different civil society actors to understand where their state is in the implementation of the right to food. And it has been quite helpful because according to the different context, the civil society has been using these, also clarifying many concepts that for them could be quite difficult. We also were working with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the development of the so-called IPSA, indicators, benchmarking, scoping, and assessment. And in this process, indicators came that have been used also by the communities when they prepare the reports to the different treaty bodies, and also when they speak to their different governments. We have also identified some gaps. One of the main gaps is a more needed part on the international dimension on the right to food. We have the last guideline, but this is not strong enough, especially now that we are working a lot on the impact of transnational corporations, of policies on investment and trade. The guidelines are quite weak on it. Of course, there are other tools that are supporting, but we think that this is one point with the CFS could also advance. And finally, regarding the good practices, I would like to highlight that even if it has been difficult to connect the Geneva work with the Rome work, this has shown that it is very important if we want accountable states to always keep the dialogue. Now the challenge is also to connect to New York, because of course the SDGs include also goals on the right to food, and this shouldn't be disconnected from the whole work that the CFS has been doing and the treaty bodies have been doing. And in this sense, we think that the national monitoring events that we are supporting could be a good space to overcome this fragmentation and bring together all the outcomes of the different monitoring exercises under the treaties in Geneva and under the SDGs, etc., to have a more holistic analysis on how the right to food is implemented in the countries and what is to be done to continue with this implementation. And therefore, we hope that many states have these national monitoring events, of course, with the participation of the civil society and the social movements. Maybe to finish with the needed support, we think that the commitment of states is very important. In Rome, we are working with a group of friends of the right to food. Maybe now it's the time also to have a group of friends of the right to food in Geneva, and using the platform that already exists in Rome. We consider that strengthening the right to food work in the FIO, maybe re-strengthening the right to food unit, as has been mentioned, would be a needed support. And of course, we as civil society continue requiring the needed resources to ensure that this process continues. It's just 14 years, and normally governments move slowly, and it means that we will have to continue working on the implementation on these and other tools, and also including that we are able to answer to new challenges that come always with the development of societies. Thank you.
Good evening. ILO is also very pleased to be here tonight among the participants. Our decent work agenda, which has 4 pillars: employment promotion, promotion of rights at work, extension of social protection, and promotion of social dialogue, is increasingly recognized as key in addressing the issues of poverty and hunger. Yet, we are not necessarily the organization that comes immediately into one's mind, when talking about food security. The reality, however, is that food security is a complex objective, achieving which would require a comprehensive approach that addresses its multiple drivers. And at the ILO, we are looking at the employment and labor issues, which are critical for both food consumption and food production. And in that sense, for us, food security translates into the ability of workers and their families to access food through sustainable livelihoods and decent work, including the ability of those engaged in food production to enjoy decent working conditions. Many studies have demonstrated the causal relationship between food security on one hand and economic growth and employment on the other. The harmful impact of poor diet, malnutrition on human capital, productivity is well known. It actually can cost countries up to 20% in productivity. On the other hand, chronic food security is directly related to employment, poverty patterns, and social protection. To illustrate the link, we can look at the economic crisis of the last decade, which placed a serious strain on many poor households. In particular, the impact of volatile food prices was greatest in low-income countries with meager food stocks. And in 2007, 2008, it pushed approximately 105 million people below the poverty line. ILO analysis at that time demonstrated that another 30% increase in food prices would have pushed another 3% of the population into below the poverty line. And a worker in those countries would need another week of employment to maintain their living standards. What is clear also from these studies is to be effective in addressing food security, economic growth by itself is not enough. It needs to come together with employment opportunities that reach poor, also in terms of better incomes. So in that sense, agricultural growth, which is underpinned by growth in labor productivity, can be most effective in addressing the issue of poverty. Paradoxically, the majority of those who suffer from food insecurity and who are unable to realize this right to food today are agricultural waged workers, as well as small agricultural producers. Again, ILO estimates that 8 out of 10 working poor, and working poor are those who work but are unable to live themselves above the poverty line. So 8 out of 10 live and work in rural areas, and the majority of them are in agriculture. In fact, a quarter of those employed in the agricultural sector live in extreme poverty. In this context, ILO's contribution to efforts aimed at tackling the food insecurity challenge is, it centers through our decent work agenda, and notably the promotion of decent work and improvement of the quality of jobs, especially in the agro-food sector, the extension of social protection, and the promotion of social dialogue and rights at work, especially in the rural economy. All of these aspects are reflected in the guidelines on the right to food, though perhaps not always as strong as we wish they would be. And of course, as we have heard today, there are many challenges in implementing those guidelines. But let me start with the rights at work, which are related to 8.8 of the guidelines. Rights at work, the way we see them, they provide an enabling environment for improved productivity and performance, but most importantly, they ensure a rights-based approach to development. So when we work on these issues, our starting point is always with fundamental principles and rights at work, which are freedom of association and collective bargaining, the elimination of forced labor and child labor, and discrimination, the elimination of discrimination in respect to employment. And then it goes beyond into all the specific standards that we have that are relevant to specific sectors. In fact, more than 30 ILO instruments, conventions, recommendations are of direct relevance to agriculture and the rural economy at large. But in terms of these standards, I want to focus now on a couple of them, and one of them that we see as key is freedom of association and collective bargaining, which is very important to ensuring sustainable wages and rural livelihoods. And again, in the guidelines, it's the first sentence that deals with the labor issues on wages. But in many countries, anti-union discrimination, legislation or administrative obstacles, such as restricted ability of workers to establish organizations in accordance with their own terms and needs, or due to, for example, minimum membership requirements, they impede workers from realizing this right. As a result, there are relatively few agricultural trade unions, despite the fact that we have hundreds of millions of agricultural workers. Another fundamental right that I wanted to mention is the abolition of child labor. Again, we have now recent estimates at the ILO, and we see that globally there are 152 million children aged 5 to 17 engaged or subject to child labor, and 71% or 108 million are in the agriculture sector. Again, to demonstrate the direct impact in our life, I would like to give example of the economic crisis again. Many countries have observed significant school dropouts at that time, and increased incidence of child labor, with IMF and World Bank actually estimating that 350,000 children were not able to complete their primary school in 2015. Child labor is a problem in the plantation sector. Sometimes children are hired as part of the enterprises producing for the domestic market and for export, part of family labor, of course not directly hired, but the majority of children are in the smallholder sector, 67%, and they work usually as unpaid laborers on their family farms. And of course, again, the reason for this is the scarcity of decent work opportunities for adults, the seasonal nature of agricultural production, low productivity and lack of knowledge and skills, inadequate incomes. So again, at the ILO, we have many programs which we implement on the elimination of child labor, and many of them actually target children specifically in the agriculture sector. On the promotion of decent jobs and income generating opportunities, especially in the rural economy, this is another key area of ILO's work. In fact, promotion of decent work in the rural economy is one of the 10 organizational priorities of the ILO, but that's not the only priority that is related to the right to food. Olivier de Soutter mentioned the formalization of the informal economy, it's another priority. The promotion of social protection flow is another organizational priority. So many of the organizational priority, although perhaps not directly linked in its subject matter to the right to food, but they directly contribute to the advancement of this right. And with more specific programs, perhaps, in that respect, you know, we can mention skills development programs, which are again mentioned in 8.9 of the guidelines, value chain development programs, and here I actually should say that the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation supports many of our projects in value chain development, and we thank them for this. Another important area that I wanted to finish my presentation with is the social protection. Again, ILO, and what makes us different perhaps in terms of approach to social protection from the Rome-based agencies is the rights-based approach. So as opposed to social safety nets, which are dealt with in the guidelines. For the ILO, you know, so we promote the rights-based approach with our standards as the principal means, and social protection flow recommendation, also mentioned earlier, requests states to establish a minimum national defined set of basic social security guarantees that, of course, have a direct impact on the ability of people to access food. In terms of, I basically mentioned, you know, all the good sides of what ILO does. In terms of the challenges, I would actually echo what the previous speakers mentioned, is maybe disconnect in terms of, you know, certain agencies. Maybe it's also important to understand that each of us have a comparative advantage, and we work in certain areas, perhaps sometimes independently, though we, of course, do contribute to our common goals and objectives. But better coordinations, better partnerships, improving our communication is perhaps key to realizing this complex and multifaceted challenge or objective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Geneva Academy and to the Swiss Development Agency for inviting us to take part in this panel. coming last can sometimes be a challenge in terms of thinking of something new or different to say to what the rest of the panelists said. But I want to thank the panel. You've covered a lot of the technicalities of the issue, and maybe can allow me to finish with some of the points in what we see as key challenges and key context for the IUF. So just let me explain a little bit more about my organization. So we're a global trade union bringing together workers throughout the food chain, in agriculture, in food processing, hotels and food services, so throughout the food chain. And we're currently made up of over 460 affiliated trade unions in 130 countries. I want to, in particular, pick up a number of comments that were made. Elvis talked about the need for workers, for people to be able to lift themselves out of poverty, and that being key to allowing them to achieve their right to food. And I think for us, as a global trade union representing workers throughout the food chain, one of the absolutely fundamental injustices that we would like to see more strongly addressed in an evaluation and follow-up to the guidelines is this reality that the agricultural workers and the small food producers who feed the rest of the world have the least access to the right to food to ensure food security for themselves and their families. Now, the IUF as a global trade union for agricultural and food workers has very strong policy commitments. Our rules, which were developed, I think, something like in the 1920s, actually commit us as a global organization of trade unions to work with broader civil society for what the rules describe as equitable distribution of the world's food resources. But I think really we started to actually look at what this meant in practical terms when, in the late 1990s, agricultural workers' unions joined together with the food workers' unions to create what is now the IUF. And one of our first real practical experiences of working around the right to food, and we do always in the IUF prefer to use the term the right to food. We find it more inclusive in terms of our policy, an approach to be inclusive of rural workers' unions, is that in 2003 we were faced with a very severe crisis in the Indian tea sector, when for a lot of reasons employers were abandoning plantations and leaving workers literally to starve to death. We estimated at the time that something like 65,000 workers from tea gardens lost their employment. The employers went away, leaving workers with no wages. On many plantations, workers have a hospital or school or other resources provided with the employers, and all of these disappeared. And we were actually faced with workers starving to death on tea plantations. And we worked then with NGOs, with trade unions in India to trigger the Indian government's obligations under its right to food provisions in the constitution to ensure that workers who were below the poverty line got access to the right to food, and that the government took aid to those starving workers. But of course, the employers and the owners of the tea gardens also had obligations. And we started to look more strategically at how we put together rights for workers with this whole discussion around the right to food. In 2008, with the food price crisis, we were also focusing on how we should advance what Elvis has described as the decent work agenda. And I think for us, 2008 also highlighted a number of key challenges because it was the first time that the ILO, for something like 20 years, had a discussion on rural employment and the contribution of rural employment to poverty reduction. So we were sitting here in Geneva, and I think quite a lot has already been talked about the links between Geneva and Rome, where in Rome, while as in Rome, the FAO was having a crisis meeting on how to deal with the food price crisis, and it struck us that there was this really big division in terms of policy coherence, and that as an organization we had to do more to encourage the agencies to work together around the understanding that decent work in agriculture had to be key to ensuring global food security, and that global food security could not be delivered without ensuring the rights of food producers like small farmers and agricultural workers, who made up the substantial part of people that were being affected by the food price crisis. And I think, Olivier, we were really behind some of the remarks you made at the time, that the crisis was not at all caused by a lack of food. The crisis was about lack of money to buy food and the rocketing food prices. And so again, this underlined for us the need to talk about wages, living wages, and the link that that had to the right to food. So when I look at the voluntary guidelines, and in particular the text there around labour, we find that, they're just too vague in terms of the encouragement around providing remuneration to allow for an adequate standard of living, and that going forward, we'd like to see much more done on how to actually achieve that, what needs to be done to ensure that rural populations, in particular for us agricultural workers, can access that right. And just in finishing, one of the things that I really want to stress is what Elvis has already mentioned, that what we see as the key barrier to that is what I would describe as a systemic and systematic discrimination against agricultural workers in terms of accessing their rights, in particular to freedom of association. Now, as a trade union, of course, freedom of association for us is a key enabling right. We would argue that having workers come together to bargain and to improve their living conditions is key to this. And what stops agricultural workers from doing that often is discrimination at national level. Agricultural workers are quite often excluded from labour legislation. This happens in the USA, in Canada, in developed economies as well as developing economies, or they have a lower level of protection from labour law. And so we think there needs to be much more policy coherence around this key enabling right for agricultural workers, that much more should be done to promote freedom of association, so that governments ensure that agricultural workers have this right and can use that right to bargain themselves out of poverty, to increase their wages and to ensure the right to food for themselves and their families. In 2015, the ILO actually produced a report highlighting some of the key challenges to this. And I think it's still really a sort of big gap that people talk around, ensuring livelihoods without understanding that, I think, not just for farm workers that we represent, but also for small farmers, it is this right to come together and to bargain, whether it be with the employer or whether it be with government, that's absolutely key. But in finishing, I just want to recount a small story. In 2016, the IUF was the secretariat to the workers group in an ILO discussion on developing a very comprehensive set of guidelines that we hoped would be really key in terms of an instrument to deliver some of the policy coherence that we've all been talking about. It was a very comprehensive document. It talked about national policy, there was guidance for small farmers, and there was a concluding chapter on plantations. We had a lot of support from governments in driving forward this document, but the block, very frankly here, and I would say it to their faces as well as to you, the block came from the employers group, who simply did not want to discuss rights for plantation workers. We spent a whole week there. We never even turned the page to start to discuss with the employers rights for plantation workers. And for me, this just underlined that they as employers understand that organised agricultural workers, organised small farmers will drive change. And that's why they were so determined to block the discussion. There's still no decision on whether those guidelines will be finally adopted. But I think in conclusion, it's really important that we talk about using the ILO instruments to ensure the policy coherence. I have seen, I think, quite positive developments in recent years with the FAO and the ILO working much closer together, but I think there's still much more work to be done there. We've been talking about the link between Geneva and Rome. That's critical. in the Committee on World Food Security, the discussion is how do we bring those Rome papers home and give effect to them on the ground. And I think that's also key. We need the two things. We need the international understanding about how the agencies work together, about how the key conventions of the ILO can support the moves towards the right to food. But I think also the obligation on governments, for us it would be key, the development of national food security programs have also to be based on decent work in agriculture and understanding that small farmers and agricultural workers are key to delivering that food security. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have some time for questions. We have heard a lot about what has to be done at the global level in Geneva and especially, but also lots of examples from the country level implementation. And we have talked about Latin America and Brazil in particular. We have also talked about India, for example. So now it's time for you to participate and ask questions if you want. Yes, there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for your very inspiring and informative speeches. Coming back to the country level scenery, well, I'm Brazilian, and I've seen that Brazil was mentioned as an example in the implementation of the guidelines, and indeed this was the context for several years. But recently these policies have suffered severe setbacks, considering that investment in public policies are now frozen for the next 20 years, and which has led to the cuts in the programs of the Social Development Ministry, such as the Food Acquisition Program, the PAA. Considering this context, I would like to know if there are international mechanisms that civil society can access to act against these kickbacks, also in the international level, because of course this is already being made in the national level. Thank you.
I have 4 very short questions. First, does anyone on the podium or in the room know a book called Lords of Hunger? I can't remember the name of the author, but I am sure it's easy to find online. Lords of Hunger. Has anyone heard of that book? I'm happy, because if you had read it, I would have to run away to escape from your anger. Second question, or it's not, the second one is more a remark or an information. I have to reveal you a secret. Everyone, even without right-based approach, everyone, starvers like starvings, know that without food you die. I think that even Genghis Khan knew that. I have read a short version of the Book of Marvels, but even Genghis Khan, when he entered the capital of China, the elder told him that it would not be good to stop distribution of bread, and even Genghis Khan realized it was the prime duty and the first basis of legitimacy of any state, so he had to, even without right-based approach. And I think, although I have not researched that FIAN did not exist then, or at least was not involved in the process. Third one, you may say that with a rights-based approach it will be better. But the irony is that I think it was precisely a FIAN speaker who 2 years back at Club de la Presse insisted that all great starvations have taken place in well-planned, progressive, left-wing nations. I was very surprised. I think that they will not invite him twice, but it was not well controlled, so he said that. It was not Jean Ziegler, you can be sure. And the last thing I like to ask, this is a true question. For now, 50 years we have blamed the enemies of the people for making the people starve, especially the traders are demonstration all the time. Now we blame them when prices go up, we blame them when prices go down, and we blame them when margins are 1%. But we realize that maybe now it's a little bit outdated, so at the last big trade union conference a few months back at the conference center, the new motto is that the capitalism and transnational cooperation and the big bad wolves make people die from thirst. They are depriving the people of water, they are privatizing water, etc. So that will also probably with time wear out. So my question is, what will be the third issue when the first two ones will be totally deflated? And a targeted question to Mr. from ILO. Do you think it is fair for ILO or any international organization, when referring to their own studies, to use the word has proven?
Thank you. Thomas, you have a question?
Thank you. Just a quick question to Sue. If you could share any concrete examples of your national members, how and in what context they have used the voluntary guidelines on the right to food. If you have one or two examples, it would be highly interesting. Thank you.
Okay, so tu veux répondre un peu?
Thanks. I would like to address two questions very briefly. And the first one concerns the recent developments in Brazil. It's absolutely a problem that the constitution has now been amended to introduce a sort of golden rule prohibiting social expenses to increase for the next 20 years. And the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Alston, has written to the government to express his discontent. Unfortunately, as regards the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, we are still waiting for the report from Brazil since a number of years, so we have no opportunity really to express the same concerns. But it is absolutely in contradiction with the commitments of Brazil on the international scene to move in the exact opposite direction than that which would be required under the duty of progressive realization of human rights, where the idea is that you should mobilize domestic resources for the progressive fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights, including the right to food. And at the very least, that requires not adopting retrogressive measures of that sort. Your question was precisely which mechanisms exist at international level that could be used to that effect. Frankly, there is not much that can be done, except for the reactions I referred to from special procedures of the Human Rights Council. In my experience, the countries that are most attentive to what human rights treaty bodies or special procedures state fall in two categories. You have either very weak countries who depend on international cooperation for their educational system, their agriculture, their health system and so on, and who therefore want to do the right thing because they fear that otherwise the aid will be denied to them. Or you have countries who have great or attach great importance to their reputation being clean. Countries such as, I mean, I hate to cite countries, but some Scandinavian countries, for example, or, you know, countries from the Western camp who need to be irreproachable in their commitment to human rights because they then can finger point others for their human rights failures. And you can only do that credibly if you yourself cooperate loyally with the system. Unfortunately, between these two categories, there's a large number of countries who do not care that much. And unfortunately, it may be that under the present administration, Brazil is falling into that league. My second reaction is to the fourth question that you raised concerning speculators, traders, and the market system being responsible for hunger and malnutrition and being in the position of the accused in these debates. I think it's really important to realize that most discussions of the economics of hunger do not really take into account power in food systems. If you look at any economics textbook, the word power does not appear in the index of keywords. And that's really surprising. Because actually, although we discuss of the price of soybean on the Chicago Board of Trade and how the price of maize and rice may evolve on international charts, what matters really is the price that the farmer gets for his or her crop. What matters is the price the consumer pays the supermarket chain for what they badly need to buy. And what matters is how strong the negotiating power of the worker is vis-à-vis the plantation owner. And these prices depend on the bargaining position of the parties, on the choices they have, on the second best option they have than to strike a deal with the person selling the food, the person buying the crop, or the person paying the salary. And so this question of power seems to me absolutely vital, and I'm delighted that today we have more and more economists that are realizing that there's a huge gap in the presentation of economic models, and that gap is a failure to look at the microeconomic dimension of how power is exercised and sometimes abused. Let's organize it together.
Yeah, maybe to the question on Brazil, I know the situation is very concerning, and I understand that Olivier says there is not much to do that is very effective. But anyways, we think that mobilization and also the use of international mechanisms is useful. I know that the organizations in Brazil have prepared a parallel report to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and they are just waiting that the review takes place. They are also trying that Brazil is revised without the report of the state, and we think that at least legally the committee has all the arguments to speak about these retrogressive measures and give strong recommendations. Of course, the recommendations of the committees are strong in so far that the movements and the people make the use of them. It's not like a judgment. And I know the organizations are also very active in the frame of the UPR and also working with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. So there is a movement there, and if you are interested in to know how to link to them, we can speak together. And to Boris, Fian was not born on that time. I can do nothing. Maybe Flavio was the one who was mentioning how the socialist governments in Latin America were implementing the right to food in the last years. Now we come to a turn to the right. And what is important in the human rights approach is that human rights are for all governments independently of the political line. So we are open to use the right to food to keep governments accountable, especially in the case work that we do, but also trying to continue with the lawmaking and policy making we have been promoting.
Thank you. A couple of questions. On Brazil also, this is clearly a major concern for our affiliates in Brazil, and we're very much involved in supporting them in mobilizations to try to reassert rights as trade unions, which we know are increasingly being rolled back. I think first, Thomas's question. So we haven't specifically used the voluntary guidelines. We did use the concepts in them, and when governments have started to incorporate the right to food within the constitution, it was that we used in India to force the government to address the needs of starving tea workers. But I think coming out of the guidelines and how we've seen them leading to, for instance, the recent discussions in the Committee of World Food Security, that has prompted us to become, as a global organisation, much more involved in the Committee on Food Security. And I did bring a little leaflet that we've done encouraging our affiliates to understand what's the CFS and how they can translate its policies, its guidelines into national action. But I think sort of still the key message that we would want to see in taking in the discussion on the guidelines is that we need to go forward with a better understanding of the contribution of waged agricultural workers to ensuring global food security. I think we felt that in 2008 there was quite a lot of understanding of what needed to be done in terms of investment in small farms, but still I often feel like I need to be there with in all of them, whether it be, well, not the ILO because we're there as a constituent, but in the other UN agencies, I still need to be there with a banner saying, what about the workers? And it's developing that understanding of the contribution of workers to ensuring global food security, and then what they need to ensure their own food security and right to food. If that answers your question. I think it was our sister organisation, Boris, that had the meeting recently in the CICG. It was the Public Services International. Yes. And we've been working very closely with the PSI on the right to water around this, again, what is for us fundamental. Agriculture, the biggest user of water, but every year agricultural workers dying because they don't have access to potable water in the workplace. So this is an area we work closely with our sister organisation. But I think also for us that's key. Right to food and right to water are often indivisible in many workplaces.
Well, there is not much to add. Of course, it's not fair, to speak only about ILO work, but, we tend to speak more about the things that we know best. The reason here is that ILO has a very strong research department. It used to be an independent institute whose focus was exclusively on labor and economic issues. But a lot of the things that I have presented today were actually done in collaboration with other UN agencies, in particular FAO on food price crisis and with the World Bank FAO on economic growth and employment. So we also speak about other organizations. Thank you.
I like to congratulate you all because when being challenged or attacked, you become much more interesting, inspiring, and I would say even human than when being applauded. So I swear I will never applaud you. I will always attack you to render you this service, and then you become a source of very interesting insight.
Thank you. Last round of question, or we go to the... Do we have a last question? If not, maybe I have a question for you. Okay. There is one? Sorry.
Thank you very much. Today, I also have, let's say, a closer look to the Brazilian context of the food security. Let's go back to the former governments where they had, let's say, a model implementation of the food security issues in the country. Quite comprehensive overall. The areas you talk today, let's say production, let's say about employment, let's say about the health and the nutritional basis. On the other hand, I see today that everybody was mentioning we kind of need more interagency, collaboration to, let's say, ensure that countries also will comprehend and perceive that food security is really a global issue in a sense of interdisciplinarity. My question is just maybe a naive question, but are there any efforts to maybe form or form a presentation, or let's say a presence of more agencies together, that this image of we need to have an interdisciplinary approach actually comes across to the countries.
Okay, if there is no more question, I will ask one question. Kaya, you didn't talk about the rights-based approach at WHO. Rights-based. Can you say something about, is it applied, rights-based approach at WHO or not? I know you have worked before on that, so if you could say some word. And then that's, I guess, the end.
Should I start? No, so in answer to your question, many thanks. I would like to recall that when the Committee on World Food Security was reformed in November 2009, one of the reasons for this reform was, in addition to the very strong enhancement of the role of civil society, was to ensure that all relevant international agencies would be working together in that forum, the most inclusive forum that would discuss food security. And so they did. They were involved in those discussions. But the problem is twofold. First of all, not all institutions have really, in good faith, played that game collectively. And I cannot avoid mentioning here explicitly the World Trade Organization, who seemed to be particularly keen to defend its domaine réservé without really accepting trade to be even part of the discussion within the CFS, which is extraordinary when you think of the impact trade has in shaping agricultural policies. The other agencies played in good faith that role, but on the other hand, there is a very strong, I use the word path dependency in my first intervention. There's a very strong inertia in agencies, so that it's not very easy for them to accept that some intergovernmental committee of the FAO should suddenly influence the way they work. And that's even true for the FAO itself, in fact. That's one problem. But the other problem is that the rise in visibility and in impact of the Committee on World Food Security has not been left unchallenged. In fact, at the very same time that the CFS was gaining this visibility in the years 2009, 2012, there was a comprehensive framework for action developed for UN agencies in another forum without the same input of civil society. And the G20, at the time under the French presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy, this was in 2011, decided, and I think it was a fantastic thing, to also discuss food security, and they had a meeting of the ministries of agriculture of the G20 discussing volatility, requesting OECD and FAO to look at volatility and speculation and so on, which is great because it showed that at the highest political level this was an issue taken seriously. But at the other hand, it was perhaps at the risk of undermining the leading role of the CFS in driving or defining the priorities and the practices to be followed. And it is not to be excluded that on certain topics I've not done the systematic check, but that the recommendations of the G20, for example, went in a direction which is not quite that of the CFS. This would need to be checked. I think for the most part it's been rather a positive thing to see this commitment, but on the other hand it created some confusion as to which forum was the most decisive one to lead on these discussions.
Okay. So thank you for the question. If you just allow me, first of all, I also mentioned Brazil in my presentation, who has been doing the commitments in the name of the Decade of Action on Nutrition. So obviously, I don't know as much of the local situation in the country as you and others in the room do. But do you think also that the commitments made under the Nutrition Decade can be used to, revitalize the great steps that you have actually taken? I'm also aware that, Brazil is taking many other steps to promote and protect healthy diets, the trans fat ban that will be coming into force and so on. I think it's really important. So I hope, that this can be seen in totality. On interdisciplinary and interagency work, I think we have a long experience in nutrition, which is one part of the guideline, with advantages and challenges, of course. But I won't go into that, given the time. Rights-based approach in WHO. We, of course, focus on the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Our core right is in our mission and mandate, now also in our general program of work that is forthcoming. In nutrition, of course, we are also concerned with the right to adequate food. We have the maternal, child and adolescent department that's concerned with the rights of children and women concerning health, adolescents. So yes, it's definitely our core business. We have a unit also working on gender equity and human rights. We think that it's no contradiction between rights-based and evidence-based, because as part of having a right, you have the right to evidence-informed actions, the best actions possible to make a good environment conducive of achieving the highest attainable standard of health.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for all the information you have shared with us on what Geneva-based institution did in the last 14 years to implement right food or support the implementation of right food at national level. So a small report will be sent to the CFS for its October session. And it was a pleasure to organize that event with the SDC. And now I invite you to stay with us and go upstairs, and there is a little reception for everyone so that we can continue the discussion all together. Thank you very much. Thank you.